All right, guys, we're going to be talking about ancient Mesopotamia. This is talked about it in the overview video called the Fertile Crescent. And a lot of times we put Mesopotamia and Egypt kind of in the same ballpark because they are actually very close to each other, geographically speaking. There's a lot of really interesting stories that go along with it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights, and that way when we do our presentation, your project that is going, well, assignment, it's going to be dealing with your choice of what civilization you want to do. You can go into a little bit more detail if this is something that you enjoy doing. All right, so this is ancient Mesopotamia. The geography means between the two rivers, or between the rivers. And so you can see this area right here is Mesopotamia. It's in between the Euphrates and the Tigris River. Both of those rivers actually go down into the Persian Gulf area. And so it is the land around it and technically between it, for that, all that goes. So there's a lot of regular flooding. Strangely enough, the Euphrates actually floods more, and has shifted its boundaries quite a bit throughout its lifespan. The Tigris has a little bit higher banks. When I was overseas, I was actually stationed in several places, and one of those places was near the Tigris River. It was in Al Qut, and it was about 30-40 miles from the Iranian border, and it was definitely interesting, we used to fly over it quite often with our helicopters. So definitely allows that silt to come up in the farmland. Same thing with the Nile River as well in Egypt. All right, so farmers built dams, channels to control, used irrigation. This is a learned technique that was kind of used throughout the rest of the world, strangely enough. All right, so Sumer is another, it's actually one of the first main civilizations in Mesopotamia around the 4500 BCE. Remember, BCE means before the Common Era. And it was organized into several city-states. So it's kind of the first main grouping of civilizations that we have record of. And the reason that we have record of is because they started writing. That was one of the best things. All right, so you got different groupings. Of course, if you have studied any of Jewish literature, or even Babylonian literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh is within this. They are quite interesting people groups, and a lot of fun to look at. Their societal structure is simply similar to a lot of the time periods. Guys, remember, we've talked about slavery not being just a recent thing. This is a thousands upon thousands of years that slavery was a big part of the economic system and social system as well. And so they would capture different groups and use that as their slaves, their working class. And then, of course, you had peasants and farmers, merchants, artists, and, of course, the rulers and priests that controlled the knowledge, right, and controlled the access to the gods and the writing and all that kind of stuff. So some of their cultural achievements: they made fine jewelry and sculptures. They actually had a lot of musical instruments. We hear a lot about the musical instruments during this time period. We can see some of the ways in which they played. They played on 12-string instruments. They understood how to craft musical instruments like flutes, and obviously that kind of stuff. Of course, I just talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a long poem about a king who travels the world, performs great deeds, searches for a way to live forever, and talks about a flood. Yes, it talks about a flood, which is kind of interesting. Matter of fact, all societies and cultures have some aspect, a record of a flood, something that happened catastrophic. Kind of interesting storyline that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, religion is obviously a big part of this, very polytheistic belief, which has poly means many, theist is God, and so many gods. Theocracy is the idea that Theos is a ruler, and the idea that religious leaders will also lead the government, and because they're religious leaders, that means they're God. They basically can say, I get to do this because God says. Now, there's an interesting religious several religious structures in Iraq, or that's typically where the Middle East, Iraq, Jerusalem, Syria, that area right there, they have temples, right? And these are called ziggurats or ziggurat. And when I was stationed at the air base in Al Talil, I was right outside, literally within basically about maybe 2 miles from a ziggurat. Every morning I would wake up, get out my door, and boom, the ziggurat right there. Pretty crazy, pretty awesome. Unfortunately, I never got to visit it because the day, sucks to be me, but the day I actually, my group was ready to go visit it, there was a bombing at the gate. So there was a car bomb that you guy tried to run through, and yeah, they kind of ixnayed the going to the Ziggurat A thing. So I never got to visit it. I was always very disappointed in that because if you have read any of the Jewish accounts of Abraham or Abram at the time, it talked about Ur of the Chaldeans. Well, that's the same Ur that talks about. So the ziggurat, and some people think that he was actually a priest at that ziggurat. So the Sumerian temples is kind of the inside of that. Cuneiform is their writing. It's a pictographic system. And it uses wedges and symbols for pictures, sounds, and ideas. Written on clay tablets was one of those things that used a lot of times more for getting economic stuff taken care of. They had some technology, used some basic math, geometry based on the 60, so 60-minute hour, 360 circle. First to use wheeled carts for transportation, and of course war as well. So they were very heavily involved in the technology aspect, and because it was in the Persian area later on, which also entails the Islamic area, there's a high degree of using the mathematics. It's kind of an interesting storyline. If you are a math person, which I am not, but if you are a math person, the idea of using math came really like the zero. The idea of a zero was from that region, right? So Sumerians overtaken by the Akkadians around the 2270 BC era. 1900, the Assyrians rise to power, and then later the Babylonians take control of Mesopotamia, and then the Persians take over that, which are the precursors of the Greeks. That's kind of how it goes, right? Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians. Boom. Okay, so this kind of is a real quick idea of how this all works. Remember, up here is the Iraq area. Over here is Iran. Over here is Afghanistan. This kind of just gives you the idea of where things are. This is a big desert here, right? And over here is on the left side, a little bit further, is Egypt. So Hammurabi, we'll be talking about him next unit a little bit more. He's a Babylonian king. He controls pretty much all of Mesopotamia. He's known for, wait for it, Hammurabi's Code. All right, this is a kind of a written code of law, one of the first ones out there. An eye for an eye is one of his famous sayings. And again, we'll be talking more about it along with religion, because he was also very religious. So this is Mesopotamia around the 1450 time period. And so you can kind of see how things worked. Nineveh, Assyria, Babylonia or Babylon area, and then Ur down here. This map a little bit not structured. The Ur is actually not that far down, but it is close to that area. So later empires, we've talked about the Assyrians and Neo-Babylons, King Nebuchadnezzar, and then you've got the Gardens of Babylon there. That is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's really pretty, at least from what I understand. And technically it wasn't in Babylon. It was somewhere a little bit west and north, I believe, but you know, still within the region of Babylon as well. Then, of course, the Persians, we'll talk more about later, and then the Persian Empire, again, that was a little bit more. So that is the whole deal of the Mesopotamia or ancient Mesopotamia. Very quick overview of that, and so we'll go on next one to ancient Egypt.